This is the first video in a 6-video series I'm going to make about CanCon 2023. I've never made a YouTube video or anything like this before, so I hope that the sound quality and everything are all functional. The first video is going to include background info, like my experience before CanCon and my army list. The next videos will all be battle reports for the games I played. I've been inspired by Rob Shepard's excellent CanCon and Novacore videos, but whereas he offers highly analytical insight into the competitive side of the game, I can only offer a newcomer's perspective. I hope this is different and fresh. I started wargaming with Warhammer Fantasy Battles in 2002, but in the mid-2010s I stopped wargaming for a while and only got back into it during COVID. Infinity quickly became my main game. I love the miniatures. I think Corvus Belli's miniatures are the best on the market. And as for the gameplay itself, I love the cyberpunk anime theme that pervades the gameplay. I like hacking. It's very interesting. It's a bit like Magic and 6th edition fantasy. But even aside from the hacking, the tactical elements, the small army size as well allows you to really bring those beautiful models to life because you can spend time on each and every one of them. That's part of why I went with JSA as my first army. I thought about going with Aleph or Nomads, but in the end I thought JSA had the best models. I really like Ghost in the Shell, so the Ghost in the Shell homage Ryukin really floated my boat too. A lot of people say that JSA isn't very good as a beginner faction, and I think this is probably true because they're pretty unconventional and hard to use. As a melee faction, I think they're particularly handicapped by their lack of smoke, but even among melee factions they're poor at shooting, with only one sniper, the Kempe Tai, in the whole army. He's also the only one with an MSV, and there's very little over 24-inch range. The Tenko missile launcher becomes indispensable. I didn't even realize most of this until I played a couple of games with Combined Army, who I picked as my second army because of the diversity of play style, and because I generally like the alien factions anyway. It was a very different experience to play an army that actually has hackers and long-range firepower and decent tags. Playing Combined Army helped inform my experience when I came back to JSA, especially as by that point I picked up a few new JSA models, most notably the Karakuri, which helped change the way that I played them. That's why I decided to take the JSA to CanCon, because I'll probably be moving on to Combined Army or something else, but I didn't want to leave my JSA behind, and I'd never been to a wargaming tournament before, so I thought it would be fair to give them a chance before I started experimenting more broadly. My experience has been in a very limited meta against 3 gentlemen here in Newcastle, Matt, Tom and Alan. The bulk of my games have been against Matt, who plays Yujing and Hak Islam. Tom plays Corregidor and Alan plays Tohar and Spiral Core. I also managed a couple of practice games against Jason Bartholomew. He played Military Orders for the first and Star Martyr for the second. And that's the totality of my experience. Going into CanCon, I'd never played Ariadna, I'd never played Aleph, I'd never played most of the NA2 and most of Pano, and I was really quite concerned about going up against factions that operated very differently. Most of all, I was concerned about the time limit, having never managed a 2-hour game before, despite attempts by myself, Matt and Alan in the build-up to CanCon. This did end up being an issue, with the time limits being quite tight, but it never ruined any of the games for me, and I'm quite happy with that. I would have liked to play more with the Hunter Infinity scene, but unfortunately I wasn't able to make Novacore in 2022, and after that the scene seemed to go into hibernation. So this is my first army list. Both my lists are very similar. I'll get to the differences shortly. There's 2 combat groups. Each one is based around a heavy infantry fire team. I experimented with several fire teams. I experimented with a Samurai Corps and a Samurai Harris, Samurai being Domru and Tenko, but it was too expensive for me to fit enough button pushers. So instead I decided to take a Samurai Corps with 3 members and then a Karakuri Harris. Karakuri Harris has Yuriko Oda because she is key to the Karakuri survival. The Karakuri is one of the longest range fire pieces I have. The profile I took in both lists has a 24-inch gun, the Mark 12, and the Panzerfausts, which even though they're disposable, they're usually sufficient to get into closer range bands where you can actually use the Mark 12 or even the chain rifle. And you're getting +1 burst by taking a Domaru with Yuriko Oda and the Karakuri. So that seemed like a bit of a no-brainer to me when I was planning on using them so much. 2 of them are specialists as well. Yuriko Oda can lay mines and fix a lot of the hacking problems. One of the reasons she's so good with the Karakuri is because of remote presence. It's unlikely that the Karakuri with 3 wounds and total immunity will go down in a single order, even though this did happen to me on multiple occasions at CanCon. But once it does go down, it's unlikely to actually fully die because it's got 2 unconscious wounds, at which point Yuriko Oda can heal her back up and get her going again which is immensely frustrating for an opponent to deal with. The Samurai Harris I took in the first combat group. Obviously the Tanko are the most excellent troops, especially for their price, that JSA can take in the heavy infantry vein, and the missile launcher is about the only good long-range firepower JSA can take. So that was the first thing I put in, and the second Tanko was cheap to save on points, although his Flamen Spear also gives me a bit of long-range firepower. The third Domaru was upgraded to Fort Observer at the cost of an order. You can see I've only got 14 orders in this group, but this was worth it because it made him a specialist. And with this fire team having a specialist, I didn't need to take a ninja or another dedicated model because the fire team could just advance up the field, killing as it goes and pushing buttons at the same time. The Kempe Tai was a later addition, and to talk to him about him, I'll have to talk about Yojimbo briefly. I proxied Yojimbo with the Kuroshi Rider model, partly because I don't like the Yojimbo model that much, but partly because Yojimbo is so necessary to play JSA in this way, in my view. He is by far the best access to smoke they have. Kuroshi Rider doesn't have smoke grenades, just the grenade launcher. With Yojimbo, you're rolling on a 17 to land smoke within 8 inches, and with his massive movement, that's actually quite a long range you can put it down in. And his crazy koalas are fantastic for protecting narrow corridors, objectives, and deployment zones. I use them all the time. And once you're putting down smoke a lot to cover your heavy infantry advance, Kempe Tai becomes quite a useful profile because JSA are also marked by low ballistic skill. Kempe Tai, who has the only sniper profile in the list, has a BS of 12, but you can take him with an MSV, and that means that the opponents are at -6 in face-to-face rolls through smoke. Suddenly you have a way to take advantageous ranged firefights. Additionally, he has number 2, and this ties into the strategy I ended up really enjoying with this Harris, which is to put the Tanko with the missile launcher on a rooftop somewhere or looking down a fire lane where he can put his 2-burst long-range missile launcher to use. And if he dies, you've still got 3 members of the fire team left, so you've got the +1 burst secured, and the number 2 means that even if he ended up being the fire team leader, you don't lose the fire team. The lieutenant is always a tough choice with JSA because there aren't really any good options. The only Warbin wants to start in hidden deployment. The tag is overcosted and spends too many of its points on melee abilities, and I didn't want to take it. The Domaru with +1 order is the only access to +1 lieutenant order that JSA has, and it's probably the best lieutenant option in its own right, but it's quite expensive. To use this +1 lieutenant order, you want a Daiokai, who is itself quite expensive, and in my view, well, okay, inferior to a Karakuri and a Harris. So I didn't want to take the Domaru lieutenant, and additionally, you're sort of wasting him if you don't put him in the front lines, because he's got great stats for combat, with martial arts and berserk and frenzy, but you don't want to lose your lieutenant. And you can take chain of command with a Kempe Tai. Like I've already said, he's in the fighting with the samurai that's advancing up the field, and he's only got 1 wound and 1 armor, so he's likely to die too. Therefore, I opted to play the shell game with the Kaisotsu. Unfortunately, due to the fact that my Karakuri needed more orders, I couldn't put all my Kaisotsu in one combat group, so the shell game was played with only 2 Kaisotsu. But that would turn out to be enough for CanCon. I never suffered from loss of lieutenant. Aside from that, I took a 7-point flash pulse remote, which I proxied with a combined army remote since I haven't picked up the Yujing ones yet. To round out the list, this first list, I took a Oni Warbin, and the Oni Warbin speaks for itself really. It is an assassin piece. It's got better than even odds of taking out almost every piece in the game, even an avatar. The biggest difficulty is getting it close enough. Although he comes with camo, you really have to deploy him well. The other downside to the Oni Warbin is that since he starts in hidden deployment, this list actually only has 13 orders and only 12 regular orders. And that gave rise to my second list. I had a number of practice games where my Karakuri were short on orders, and so the addition of an additional Kaisotsu and swapping out the Oni Warbin for a cheaper missile launcher Ryukin brought me up to 15 orders, none of which were lost in hidden deployment at any stage of the game, and also added to my long-range firepower. It gave me control of an additional range band and allowed me to play armies that relied on subterfuge at their own game. The Ryukin can also start with a shock mine deployed. So my army in total, with the other Ryukin that I took in both lists, the killer hacking device one, which was one of my main button pushers, starts with 3 shock mines and a crazy koala put down, if that would be advantageous to me. This does a lot in making sure that I can't be wiped off the table in turn 1. And if I don't put them down in turn 1, it means I can spend any spare orders I have securing objectives with a lot of mines and crazy koalas. I was quite happy with these 2 lists. I'd practiced with them both a fair bit. I was looking forward to trying them out at CanCon. You can see at the top of this screenshot that I played about 21 games in 2022 and in January 2023 in the build up to CanCon. I played a dozen or so games before this, but they're probably not worth keeping track of because we got a lot of rules wrong. A lot of them were smaller scale or used a different army. The bottom of the screenshot, you can see which list I was planning on taking against which opponents. I didn't really know what would be good for what, but I knew that Pano and Yujing and a lot of the other only weapon lists often had a really strong piece, like a tag or a heavy infantry piece that they relied on. And the lists I intended using a Ryukin for are often more based around subterfuge, and having the extra orders and board control might be more beneficial. With Aleph, I was concerned about Natural Born Warrior cancelling out a lot of the only weapons benefits. I wanted to go over the rules, and especially the ITS rules again before going to CanCon, just to make sure I had everything in my head, because there wouldn't be time to look up rules properly, and I needed to know how things worked before I did them. And unfortunately I ran out of time. The main consequence of this was that I didn't really know how the tournament scoring system would work. Obviously I knew how to get objective points in the individual missions, but I didn't really understand tournament points for wins and major wins and for losing by less than 2. And I didn't know that you got tie broken on the amount of models you had left surviving. This would have changed pretty much none of my actions. However, I was so focused on getting wins that I was willing to sacrifice pieces willy-nilly if it increased my odds of getting a win by even a fraction of a percent. My goal was to win 2 games from 5, which I thought would be quite impressive for a new player at his first tournament with probably a not very competitive list. I was expecting to only win 1, so that was sort of par. I would have been disappointed to have won none. I met a lot of fun people. I never met anyone who I didn't think was kind and friendly and who I didn't have a great time with. I really enjoyed meeting people like Rob Shepard and Ryan from Brutal Cities and Val from Loss of Lieutenant, who I had heard about and seen online but had never met in person. I'm really glad I went. I'll recommend it to anyone. My next video will be the battle report for the first game I played.